Hey there, listener. Corey Andrew Powell here, and I'm excited to share that Motivational Mondays is now sponsored by BetterHelp. Feeling stressed or anxious? Well, BetterHelp brings you online therapy that's convenient and affordable. NSLS members get 50% off your first month of BetterHelp when you sign up at betterhelp.com/NSLS or click the link in the show notes. Start your journey to better mental health today. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Motivational Mondays, the podcast presented by the National Society of Leadership and Success, now impacting over 2 million members. I'm your host, Corey Andrew Powell, and I am so thrilled today to be joined by the very inspiring Deidrea Miller, a communications strategy consultant whose career spans government, luxury, and the arts as well, from serving as deputy communications director for New York City Mayor de Blasio to leading communications at Christie's. Deidra brings powerful insights on leadership, diversity, and strategic communications. I'm happy to share her story with you today, so let's get started. Deidra, welcome to Motivational Mondays.
Thank you for having me, Corey.
It's my pleasure. Now, I hope I got that intro right because you've done a lot of stuff. So was I on point?
That you did very well, very well. So thank you, thank you.
Oh, well, thank you for being here. And first of all, I just will say when people hear the word, well, okay, maybe me, but most people, we just hear the word Christie's. Let's just start with that, and we just think of just this other world of luxury that is unattainable that most of us would never really be able to even sort of be aligned with. And so I'm fascinated that you were involved with Christie's and also involved in a very significant Andy Warhol painting. Can you just share a little bit about that before we get into the rest of your story?
Sure. So the first major sale that I worked on, I think it was in 2022, was selling Andy Warhol's Shot Sage Blue Marilyn. I believe it still is the most valuable painting now from the 20th century. It's sold for just under $200 million. And it was really secretive. It was a moment where there were these siblings who had this iconic painting. There are only 4 of them, I believe. They're in different colors. And they would actually put the painting in their back seat when they would drive from their city house to the country house. So it was very sort of, I always like to tell that because it's very quirky and people think that these objects are, shipped around in armored cars. In fact, people live with these objects.
Right.
And so, unveiled it live on television for cameras from all over the world. And it really kind of, I think, started a moment. I don't care what anybody says. I am convinced that Kim Kardashian wore Marilyn Monroe's dress at the Met Gala because that painting was really everywhere. And it was really fabulous to see people from all backgrounds, especially young people who we didn't traditionally see in the galleries, coming in, being really excited, wanting to take their pictures with it. It was a really wonderful moment.
That is a great idea too, how that bridges the gap, things like that, right, between generations.
Yeah.
I know many people, of course, come down on the Kardashians a lot. So it's interesting that you brought Kim Kardashian up because as a pop culture figure, I mean, it's really interesting how many people, kind of come down on her a lot. But I'm like, she literally bridges the gap in a whole different way with some audiences. And that's a prime example because a lot of kids had to look up, if you can believe it, they were like, who's Marilyn Monroe? And they didn't even if you can believe that, there were still some people who didn't even know until Kim wore that dress. So that's a really, really good point. And so your role in communications, as we talk to a lot of people who are always trying to find their way through their careers, I find it fascinating to sometimes talk about different careers and career paths. So your career path as in the communications field, what drove that passion for you? Was that just something you fell into, or had you always been interested in that?
Well, if I would probably ask my mom, she'd say I'm a big talker. So I guess it just makes sense that I'd be in communications. I grew up in a household where my parents were public servants and they were really dedicated. So, for my father, he was an expert in public housing and housing policy. My mother was really at the front line of passing some of the most, groundbreaking legislation around equal opportunity in the workplace, working with unions, really working with really difficult issues in New York State. And I just really grew up around that, around, reporters calling the House, state troopers coming and looking in on us to make sure we were safe. And sometimes there were threats, things like that. And just seeing their dedication and their ability to communicate really difficult things like land use, or passing the first sexual harassment protections in New York State. Really complicated issues that are being boiled down into ways that it doesn't matter whether you have a PhD or you didn't finish high school. You can still understand what is going on in your community, and you can tell a story that makes people feel like they are invested and that they're a part of the narrative, the stories that are going on around them. And I always found that really fascinating, of how do we tell stories where people can see their own lives reflected back? How do we tell stories that provoke or motivate people to act, whether it is buying a product, whether it is voting, whether it is filling out your child's free lunch school form? How do we tell stories that resonate with people? And I've always found that really fascinating. Even when I was a kid, I just always really loved the way that people crafted stories and told them.
Yes, that is wonderful, because I relate to so much of that. With me as well, it was always like, he talks too much. I'm like, well, that's what I do for a living now. So thank you. That was called rehearsal. Basically, that's what I say. But it's true, because, when you also emulate what you see in your home, that's a really great lesson too, for people to realize that children and young people are watching, and they are getting inspired by, very often, their parents' actions and what their parents' interests are. So that's a really great point to drive home as well. So when you worked in other industries, however, it was always in the communications field. I mean, that was like the common thread. I know you worked, as I mentioned, government, luxury, and art. And so was it always in the communication space?
It's always been communications. It's
Wow.
always, it's just, my very first job working in press was working for Eliot Spitzer in his press office when he was Attorney General. Every summer I came home from Michigan, and I worked for the Attorney General by day, and I worked at Banana Republic at night. And there is, it's a career if you're an adrenaline junkie. It really is, the thrill of, whether it be a press conference or dealing with a crisis, you're in the room with leaders as they are contemplating the futures of their companies, as they are thinking through the futures of their employees, of our sort of collective narratives sometimes, I think, in politics. And you have this opportunity sometimes to be that voice in the room. I always like to use this, it's a little cliche, but I always like to say, do we want to be the good guys here?
Yeah. I mean, plain and simple, right? Because they're well, and I'm not going to get political on this show, but there is that sense of like, it's either this or that. And to some people, this is the right way and this is the wrong way. And which one do you choose, right? So which side do you choose to be on? And many people die on that hill, whatever it is for them. They make that choice, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah. So what do you think about when it comes to currently, as you mentioned about people seeing themselves in these spaces, that brings up that opens up the conversation about diversity and inclusion. Because as I mentioned, as a little boy, for me growing up hearing the word Christie's or Sotheby's, like I'm just be real, I thought of like white people, period. And I thought of white people being the communicators in that space and controlling that space. And so what I find for myself today is when I'm, as an African-American man, in a role, as I have been often, as the person who's head of communications for a brand, it feels like, wow, that's a really big progressive thing, although it shouldn't really be. I mean, it shouldn't be that, but it is in some ways. So what do you think about the idea about seeing more of us in spaces like that to make it sort of normalized? I mean, is that a part of also what you represent?
It's it's a complicated question these days. I think I'll always believe that you have to see it to be it. But I think if we go back to what we were saying in the beginning of the conversation, we've always been here. We really have, whether it's Anne Lowe, who was designing clothes for Jackie Kennedy, or Andre Leon Talley, or, I think about, I was reading this book called The Private Librarian about Bella DaCosta Green, who was JP Morgan's private secretary. And she was a Black woman who was passing. And she was bidding in Sotheby's and auctions at Christie's in the manuscripts departments in the 1920s, in the 1930s.
Wow.
She was there. We have been creators of art and beautiful objects, whether you can wear them or not, since, time immemorial. And so I think as much as we obviously want to see more of our faces there, and we want to see more of our stories and represented in these spaces. I think it's also important that we also find the ways to elevate the stories that we also have right now. I think about all of these histories that are now coming out just because there are more people who are interested in sort of Black history or any history, frankly, that's just non-Western history.
Yeah.
And you really see how, I always think about how, I'm going on a tangent. I don't know if you're going to edit this.
Please do.
I'm a little jealous of my daughter sometimes because, she got to grow up knowing that there was a Betsy Coleman. And I grew up dressing up as Amelia Earhart. And for her to have Bessie Coleman, to know that there was this Black woman stunt pilot who sewed clothes, washed dishes, to leave to go to Paris to get a pilot's license because she wasn't allowed to do that in her own country. To see that commitment, to see that excellence, from someone who unfortunately I'll never get to meet, I think that's another way of saying that, it's not just about me showing up in 2021 or me showing up in 2030. I think it's important that we also look back a little bit too and look to the people who came before us as well, to tell those stories, to inspire young people, because we didn't have those when we were younger. I probably would have become a pilot if I had
right.
had Bessie Coleman, in my past. But yeah.
Yeah. Wow, that is fascinating. And there's something, and it could just be a shared experience because we are both people of Afro heritage in America. But so much of what you're saying, it feels so familiar to me because I was terrified of flying, and the right circumstance presented itself for me in 1999, and I went to France for the first time. And I went to Europe for the first time, I should say, and it was France. And it was even better because it was like the northern coast, like in Saint Michel, and like it wasn't like just Paris, and I really got to. And for a moment, I was obsessed, like I'm living here, I'm moving there. But I was like all enthralled in books, and I had this book about all the different arrondissements, and I was like, But the inspiration that made me get on that plane, it was just fascinating, was the film about Josephine Baker that HBO had done with Lynn Whitfield. And I became obsessed with Josephine Baker. And also I'm a big fan of Grace Jones. And those two Black women represented Paris and France to me, which was so sort of like not what maybe a white young person would have associated with those countries. But for me, they were France. They were the beauty. They were the sexy. They were it's interesting how that perception got me on a plane to go to Europe. So you're right. I mean, it was based on our past leaders, if you will. I mean, Grace is still here, of course, but Josephine was one, that is no longer here. But that inspiration got my butt on a plane, and I was terrified to fly over that ocean, but I did it.
Yeah. And those folks are fearless. And I'm going to forget the gentleman's name, but there was a gentleman who was instrumental in the Give the World Coke ad, and it was a Black ad man, or, the stories of Black architects are now being told.
Yeah.
There's so much inspiration. I think what is important when you are in this job, in this space, is you kind of, what is it they say? Journalism is the first draft of history. I probably got that quote a little bit wrong, but it's also up to people like me who tell stories to keep some of those stories alive too, and to reference some of those stories. And so whenever there's an opportunity for me to tell that, uphold that, share that personally, professionally, I always take that opportunity.
What's your take on the role of social media today, good, bad, or indifferent?
I think that I've seen it act as a real catalyst for change, I think, in society in really positive ways. But I think also, I don't know, I just started to read The Anxious Generation, but there is something that I have, how do I put this? I think getting back to connecting with one another and the nuance that comes from that is really kind of key. And I'm not sure sometimes how much social media is helping us do that. And I haven't been deep in the algorithms and things like that for quite some time. So I don't want to be out of pocket on that one. But I definitely, I think, it's not going away, but there's certainly, I do see sometimes, even when I'm dealing with, journalists, there's really a desire to be in front of people, in front of, to connect in person, to,
Yeah, and that's the distinction between, and we discuss this a lot too, especially in the evolution of AI. We discuss on the show a lot the importance of, some people call them soft skills, but then others will say, no, those are called durable skills. And that is the ability to be empathetic, to be collaborative, to, to think critically with emotion, as opposed to an AI algorithm that's going to just spit out like the logistical response to what you prompted. And so, I think that's a lost art that if we're not careful, you will have a generation of people who they don't know how to emotionally communicate with each other. And the bigger example of that, like I'm a New York City, former New York City club kid, okay, from back in the day. And I remember that was the whole communal part of the dance floor. You'd be in the big warehouse clubs back in the early 90s, like thousands of people in these clubs. And we all went for this collective experience. So I went out like maybe recently, but after, years of not going out, and the kids are on the dance floor with their cell phones. I'm like, what are you doing? They're like dancing. I'm like, come on now. And they're not even having that collective experience in a space where they've gone to have a collective experience. So I don't know. It's a difficult balance. I don't know if we're better off with social media or worse. I can't tell.
Yeah.
Anyway, I guess that's not an easy answer. But I do want to know also for you, what did you learn from the most challenging experience you've ever had as a communications expert? Did you have that one thing where you're like, this one almost took me out? I don't know how. Do you have one of those experiences to share, or something close to that was challenging?
Good communications is leadership. And one of the most important aspects of leadership is integrity and modeling behavior that you want the people who follow you to do as well. And that means sometimes it can be, advocating for apologies sometimes, and the great art of the apology, recognizing sometimes that you've done harm, even all the things that go along with, communications and things like that. But truly great communications is leading by example and leading through adversity and leaning into that adversity and not necessarily running away from it.
Mm-hmm.
And those, I think, have been some of the toughest times that when I've worked on tough issues, is working in situations where the principal may want to hide, when in fact it's time to kind of run at the problem as opposed to running away from it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, that's when I've had those conversations on the show, really successful leaders in different spaces, from whether it be an Olympic athlete or even CEOs or the CEO of like Chuck E. Cheese or whatever it may be. In most cases, there's this common denominator of a moment they had adversity. They were even afraid of it. Maybe someone gave them a task and they were not sure if they can do it. But instead of saying no out of fear, they said yes, and I'll figure it out when I get there, because they didn't want to then miss out on the opportunity out of being paralyzed by fear. So I think you're right. Facing the adversity has a lot more rewards than running away from it. Absolutely. And speaking of adversity, I have been trying to master different languages forever, and I can't do it. But you, on the other hand, so you're fluent in French.
Yeah.
And did you live in France for a long time, or you just learned here and you're just badass like that?
I started learning French when I was 14 years old, and I took it through college and grad school, and I spent quite a lot of time in France. And
Mm-hmm.
I've had the good blessing to have many French people become close friends and confidants.
Mm.
And just over the years, just through the travel and sort of social interactions, my French has become quite good.
Wonderful. That's wonderful. And also conversational German, as I understand it. Now,
Yes.
that's a little more difficult, right? I would imagine. So did you live in Germany as well? That's just you have an affinity for languages at this point.
Well, I had a family member who is German, and I spent a great deal of time in Germany. But prior to that, I was at the University of Michigan, and I'd passed proficiency in French. So they required me to take another language. And at the time, I think I was maybe 19, 20 years old. My parents made me pay for my own textbooks every year. So I had a stake in school. And I really wanted to learn Italian, but the German textbooks were cheaper. And I just kind of said, okay, we'll go with German.
Right.
And so I know that's not the most
that's not
eloquent answer, and then it just kind of stuck, because I ended up living with the Germans, spending a lot of time in Germany, and and even now I have a very large German contingent in my family, so it just kind of kept up. So now I'm surrounded by it now almost every day. So
that's amazing. And it's funny too, because again, like I said, you feel so familiar to me, because the second country I visited after France was Germany, which is like when I was in 2006. So it's kind of funny. That was my sort of trajectory. But I left speaking nothing except for like in shoulders and Z or something. I don't know. And I made a mistake once in Spanish, because I thought the word embarazada was embarrassed. And I told someone I said, oh, estoy muy embarazada, which was pregnant, which was not really, whoopsie. So I'm still working out my language stuff. But you raised a great point here again, too. The multilingual experience, I think, is such a big benefit. And we live in a country here where there's a significant piece of the population that's like, speak English, we don't speak that here. And it's, it's so egregious in many ways. But how, for you, if you think about it from a bigger picture, how has being multilingual benefited you professionally? Like what are the benefits of that versus anything negative?
Yeah, I think it's been really great when I've had opportunities to work in French. That's been just fantastic. It's been wonderful that way. I think it has given me a little bit of a third culture sort of leaning. I'm quite open to people, I think, just generally, and you'll tend to find me surrounded by people from very different backgrounds with different languages, not even necessarily people who speak languages that I speak. So I guess I'm not, Yeah, I think I've always been, it's always been very easy for me to build bridges with people and to get to know people and to find common ground with people, because I've been in situations where I'm the person who's speaking broken French. I'm the person who's speaking German that, is not perfect. I have the accent when I'm speaking. So I think it's just opened me up to, I talk to everybody. It's what happens at the end of the day.
Yeah, same. Yeah, and I find that when you do try to speak other people's languages, they are really endeared by that. Like they really appreciate the effort. And my first time, in France, I witnessed Americans getting angry at French people for not speaking English. It was just like absurd. They're like, you see them visibly getting upset. I'm like, I'm not sure if you realize that 7-hour, 6-hour flight that you just took was to another country where they don't speak English primarily. But yeah, it's a weird thing that we have to kind of work through. And I think maybe it's driven by xenophobia here. But I just hope that we can get this message out that there are benefits to you learning how to speak other people's languages. So,
I think one of the things I really used to love when I was, younger, when I was in school and I was studying history and I was studying political science, but I mostly studied comparative politics, European politics, and things like this. And it was at the lead up to the Iraq War when I was in college, and I remember, I don't do it as much as I did back then, but just being able to read the French newspapers or to read the German newspapers and to see their perspective and to see their leaders talking about, global conflict and things like that, or politics, and also understanding their approaches in the political context of, at that time, a really pro, European Union expansion. There was just the introduction of the euro, and and being able to read about history that was really kind of unfolding in front of me, but through the lens of journalists from those countries, when a lot of it wasn't being covered necessarily in the United States at the time, or to just kind of see that other point of view it's just extremely beneficial in terms of giving me a really well-rounded take. And if I bring it up to today, oftentimes now I'm working on, it'll be a global communications issue, right? And you're thinking about, you have employees who are around the globe. And when you're able to get a hot take from Le Monde or Le Figaro or, Die Zeit, you are able to kind of see, okay, we may think making a statement on X issue in the United States is what our employees want, but we have a broader employee base. And therefore we have to thread a needle, and we have to have a narrative that unites the population with very different sort of cultural leanings and perspectives and insecurities and, different political contexts. You have to unite that as a company. You can't just sort of put something out and then say, okay, see you later, our German offices or our English offices. You're one company. And so it's really kind of given me a lens and given me an opportunity to really kind of look at those issues, not just simply through the American perspective, but through an international one.
Yeah, that is so important. I worked for a firm once that actually, they had international offices, but they had not factored in that certain dates they wanted people to work were religious holidays for some people in other countries, whether it be, Arab countries or whatever it was. It was like, no, they can't do that day. So you can't have that meeting on that day. And that had not been something they had considered. So you're right. Now that we're in this really big, more of a global communicative space, all those things definitely have to be considered. Gosh, I have one more question for you.
Please.
And you almost sort of tapped into this before when I asked you what were the skills you thought were important for someone looking to get into communications. But this is more of a broad question, which would be, what would be one piece of advice in general you give to someone who is looking to start working in communications, in art, communication arts as a career? What would you advise them?
I would say that it doesn't matter what stage you are in your career. If you're passionate about the arts, do not let having a W-2 form stop you from being involved in the arts. And there are ways of getting involved in your community. I love the arts, the performing arts, in every sort of iteration of art. I love art. And it really changed my life. And it's something that I'm deeply passionate about, especially arts education and using the arts as a way of opening up the horizons and the perspectives of young people who haven't traditionally been exposed to the arts, because I think it's a great, I'm sorry, getting me at this, it's a great on-ramp to everything from science to history to social justice to design. It's just such a wonderful way for young people to being international, languages. It's such a wonderful on-ramp for all of those things. And so if you're passionate about the arts, get on a board, join your local community. You know, a lot of museums have young collectors groups, they have young patrons groups, they have free programming a lot of times, you know, once or twice a month. Start talking to people. They become a docent. You know, I had a very short time as being a docent for the Studio Museum in Harlem. So I always start first by saying, do not let having a paycheck in the arts, not having a paycheck in the arts stop you from being in the art world, because there are a lot of ways in. And if you do want to make a career, it is those experiences that will actually help you to transition into a full-time job. So I worked in energy. I was working in government policy for energy, for education, for water and environmental conservation, in different parts of my life. And one of the things I always did was I always was going to museum openings. I was talking to people. I volunteered my time. I used to volunteer at the Studio Museum. They used to have, I don't know if they still have it, but in the mid-aughts, you could sit with kids and you do these art projects with kids in the basement of the Studio Museum based on the collection upstairs. And, and I loved it, just working with these kids, gluing stuff to paper. And there's a way of being there, and you get to know the people in the museum and you get to be a part of that community. And then when the opportunity presented itself, you sort of leap at it. And the way I got really into the arts full time was working in the mayor's office and having cultural affairs be in my portfolio. So, and then monuments, I sort of became the mayor's go-to person for all thing monuments, whether it was putting up monuments or taking down monuments or analyzing and auditing monuments, became my role within the mayor's office. So I got to know a lot of different leaders around the city. And then that became my job working at Brunswick Arts, was working with arts institutions in crisis, especially in 2020 and 21, whether it be around, union efforts. Well, I have a government background. I know a thing or two about unions, whether it be about, issues around inclusion, diversity, and workplace behavior issues. Well, when you work in government, there's sure a whole lot of that. Everything has those elements. Or you're looking at financial constraints and things like that. Well, government's nothing but financial constraints. So, there are all of these muscles that I had been working out. I just was able to, because I knew the institutions, because I knew who the leaders were, because I knew the issues facing them, because I was a board member or an art collector or just a patron of these institutions, I was able to bring it all together to work for Brunswick Arts, which then turned into the role I had at Christie's.
Yeah. Listen, I think what's so fascinating about that is it's a point that we drive home a lot here at the NSLS, which is to take things along the way on your journey and just learn. You're never finished learning. The growth mindset is really important. And all those pieces come together for you at some point in life. And as you are an example of, you are now a culmination of all those things in your current role. So it's fascinating that you are really someone who shows how that works, and it works really, really well when you are, I guess for a better term, just absorbing life as you're going through it, not just having the experience, but letting it really, really sink in. So this is a fascinating conversation. I'm so happy you and I were finally able to connect, because I know we had some experiences in the past couple weeks where communication, we couldn't get it together, but here we are. I'm so happy that you joined me today here on Motivational Mondays. Deidrea Miller, it's a thrill, an honor, and I wish you all the success, and please come back and talk to us soon.
Thank you.